we're in the jewelry business. And in this business, they do something called consignment sales. Now, what a consignment sale really is the company who's going to do the selling does not take inventory risk, meaning they don't buy the inventory and sit on the inventory and do it. They may take physical possession of it, but they don't really own it. The company who's supplying the inventory owns it. And the basic deal they do is when the jewelry store sells the jewelry, pay the supplier now. You owe the supplier for what you do. And that's called a consignment business. So the idea here is that when there is an actual sale of the good, which would be represented by a customer invoice or cash sale, what basically has to happen is a user interface has come up that says, find all the related purchase orders for which we brought in those goods. Then basically they're going to get organized in a particular way, and we're going to go through a server plugin, and we're going to actually generate a bunch of vendor bills because we need to pay the suppliers. Then we're going to actually go back and we're going to update these customer invoices and cash sales because we added a custom field on the line there on the sales side to say, how many of these things did we actually bill, meaning vendor bills, did we pay for, as a way to kind of get control over what's happening in the environment. So I'm going to turn this over to Sylvain now.
You can talk about the three parts here. There's three tables that appear. Two of them are empty at the start, and there's really two sources of data. So there's sold items and unbilled items. Sold items is a query that's going to look at transactions of the sales type, invoices and cash sales and credit memos as well. And where the quantity billed is null or the quantity billed is different from the quantity on the line, so that we can only display items that we can bill, right? So the idea is after we build them and after we update that custom field that says, okay, we build this, we don't want to see this in this table anymore. Okay, and that's loaded on request as we load the page, and there's really no other criteria here. So we do a blanket sort of, you get them all. On the other side, there's an unbilled items data source, and that's over here. Here again, we're looking at transactions, but we're only looking at purchase orders. And again, the idea is where the quantity is different from the quantity billed. So we're trying to build up a master list of all the different POs that we can bill, right? And the app is going to show to the user when they select one of the items at the top, it's going to just display on the bottom any POs that exist that contain that item with unbilled quantities. The functionality on the bottom it doesn't let the user choose which POs are going to get billed. Client was asking for us to, when we have things to bill, walk through the list of POs in chronological order, starting from oldest. So just bill all that you can, starting from the oldest PO. There is some functionality here because this cost is the cost field that exists on the item, which might change over time since the PO is constituted. So if it goes up or down, then it'll be highlighted as red. I'll show you like this. This is defaulting to the purchase price when you load the app, which is the price that exists on the PO. If the cost on the item at this moment is different than what the PO cost was, then we're going to highlight this to tell the user, hey, there's a difference here. Do you want to bill at the purchase price, or do you want to bill at the cost price, the item's price? So that's just a little bit of client-side functionality that if I were to sort of change all these numbers and make them all different and select the ones that I want to update, I will update those ones to the current item cost. So that's just a little bit of client-side functionality. What ends up going to the bill is the value that the user puts into this input box. They could put in anything they want, essentially. Okay, so what happens when you click on one of these things? So if I click these two, it's actually the same item on two different invoices, total quantity of 10. That's why the PO list didn't change, because it's the same item. So I want to see all POs that exist for this item. So I'm saying I want to build 10 of these items. And there's a bunch of them. There's 12 of them that exist across POs. So I guess we could bill, if this is in chronological order, right? We can bill all the way up to this one here. So when you click the top button, what's going to happen is, well, on the client, I sort of build up the data. I figure out how many vendor bills am I going to create and what are they going to be. If you take a look here, I'm going to have a vendor bill for this vendor. I'm going to have a different vendor bill for this vendor because it's a different vendor. But then for this vendor, has the same location as the first one. So I can just stack these two quantity on that first vendor bill. And then for the remaining two, because we only got up to 8 now, and if I want to build 10, I need 2 more. I'm going to have to create a third vendor bill for this vendor, which is the same vendor, but a different location. And so I get to set the vendor and the location on the vendor bill. These checkboxes don't really make any difference at all. So what's going to happen is I'm going to figure out and do some sorting, figure out that I need to create 3 vendor bills. So I'm going to send 3 requests to the server plugin to create 3 individual vendor bills. They're going to do their thing, and they're going to return, and they're each going to tell me if they succeeded or not. And if they succeeded, they're going to tell me what is the quantity that was billed. From there, I can say, okay, that means that I need to update these invoices with the actually billed quantity to update this custom field on the sales transaction so that they don't appear in this table again. They're going to get filtered out by this query. And then in the meantime, I'm going to update the little table over here to tell us what vendor bills got created. We could click on them. I'm going to reload the purchase order list. And once those sales transactions get uploaded, I'm going to reload the sales transaction list. And let's see if that works. So creating 3 vendor bills, that gets sent out, three requests to create the vendor bills. We wait.
I can see that it called out to the plugin. So it's called out to the server.
3 times, once for each of the 3 bills that we want to create. Okay, we got something back. It created those 3 things. It figured out, it updated the bottom list. It figured out that it needs to update 2 sales transactions. So that's the next thing that happens. Send out 2 requests to update those 2 invoices. We wait for those 2 things to update. And once they're done, the top table should update, and we shouldn't see that item anymore at all. Query start. Yeah, I'm still updating sales lines. Start. This query up, there you go. Okay, and then that item is gone. And we can go and delete those vendor bills if we want and reset the data so that we can go and try it again. So that was pretty good. So we had these 3 calls to plug in create vendor bill. The 3 requests came back with success true. Told me that this one created, actually billed 5 of them, and that the vendor bill text was this. So this is how I created this. And I have the ID of the vendor bills. If I click on it, I can actually get to it. Okay, so 3 times there. And then I figured out what I needed to do for updating sales lines. So I need to update sales lines, and quantity to bill was 8 and quantity actually billed was 8. So this is the update that the update sales line plugin function does. Right after I send out those 2 things, I update the purchase order query, which is down here. That came back pretty quickly in half a second. So we saw the table at the bottom update quickly. And those update sales lines took 30 seconds, but it happened at the same time. So that's good. And then we update that top table. It took less than a second. And then we have their screen again, and they can continue with their work and maybe query something else. What do you think, Boban? I can see your face there.
Blows my mind, man. This is amazing.
Okay, so we can take a look at what happens. This is actually, I showed this last week, and it was a little bit wild here, but I mean, we can take a look here. Let me just make sure this thing's always on the top so that we don't lose it. Right, so this is the Consignment Inventory Handling app, CIH. You know, I build the top row, and I put a button in it called generate, and I say, okay, when you click on that button, run this function. So that's what happens. That's how I tell it to do that. Okay, then I build the top table, height percentage 45%, so it doesn't fill the whole screen. And I put 2 boxes in there, one length 9, one length 3, because I want that new bills there to be just a quarter of the width, like that. Okay, and then I build another box beneath that's going to hold this button over here. And when I click that one, I click the bottom button, and this function is a little bit lower down here. It doesn't do much. It just does some client-side stuff. It updates It updates the list according to the way that we want. Okay, so this is the canvas part, right? And then we create a panel for the bottom table, and we give it a name. And then this promise.all here is the functionality. This sold items and unbilled items correspond to these two tables here that we saw, unbilled items and sold items and unbilled items. And they're set to request on load app. So the request is the request event is initiated right away, but I need to wait for them before I draw it. So I wait for both of those things to complete inside of a promise.all. And once both of those are complete, I draw them. I draw them inside the pieces, the boxes that I built up here. And that's what the init does. It draws the boxes, waits for the load events of the two main data sources that I have to finish loading, and it draws the list inside of the boxes. Okay, so when we click the top button, this is the part that gets a little bit crazy. So when we click the top button, first thing we do is we read the selected items. You know, sold items, list, get selected records, export models. So in other words, I know that this got read. I sorted by item ID, so now I know that all the items are grouped together. And then I reduce it into an array. Because it could be like we had that an item is in 2 rows. And I want to group the items together, and I want to reduce it by item. So what I do is so when you do a reduction, right, you're passing in a callback function whose first parameter is an accumulator that you need to return at the end of your callback, otherwise it's not going to work. And your second parameter in the callback function is the individual row of the array. So that's the basic structure of reduce. Your callback function takes an accumulator, which you need to pass back, and then it takes each element that you're looping through. So first thing I do is I check, is the accumulator empty, or is the last object in the accumulator not the same item as the one in my current row? If it is, then I create a new object in my accumulator. And here's where I say quantity and quantity actually build. This will get used later, but quantity is something that I accumulate, that I sort of I keep adding every row on. And sales lines is I just push those sales lines in there because each item could have 3 invoices, and I want to keep track of those because later on, way down the process, I want to update those sales lines. Okay, so we have our selected items. For each of them, I get all the POs that refer to that item. And this is just the unbilled items data source. And I get all of them. And I filter for all the POs that have that item. Okay, and then I sort them chronologically. Great, so that's the client request. We need to only build these things chronologically. Then I do this thing where I bill as much as I can on each quantity. So the quantity left is the quantity for the item that I want. That's been updated for all the sales lines quantities. For each PO line on this item, I bill as much as I can. Math min, quantity available to bill, and quantity left. And then I decrement quantity left. And I keep doing that as long as there's quantity left to bill. Okay, so then, and here's the nice thing here. First of all, I see, okay, I only want to actually send to the server those POs that I'm actually going to bill. So quantity to bill needs to be positive. So I filter that out. And then I sort them by vendor and location. So even if, like we saw, the first and the third row had the same vendor and location, but there was something in the middle, I want to bring those two together so that I create a single vendor bill for those two. And that's just here by grouping them together. So then I create my bills array by taking my PO lines and reducing it. Again, my accumulator, my individual PO line, and it's really the same logic as what I did up here. If the accumulator is empty, if this is the first line, or the last one doesn't have the same vendor, or the last one doesn't have the same location, create a new bill, push a new bill with that vendor in that location and an empty sort of array for the PO lines. And all you have to do is push that PO line on that last one. So then I have for each item that's been selected, I have a bills array that will be created for that item. Okay, and then I make sure that items to bill, I only take the items that have bills to bill, that have bills to create. And then here's where we start calling the server, calling the plugin. Okay, this is for some UI stuff here. I figure out how many bills I'm going to be creating. And then promise all settled. So I flatten out my items to bill array into all the bills that I want to create. I don't care what items they are, I just want to know how many items I have. And I map that flat array to an array of calls to the plugin, main.server.plugin create vendor bill. The promise all and the promise all settled functions expect an array of promises. So when I take my items to bill and I transform it to an array of server plugin calls, server plugin is a promise. Every call to the server, whether it's plugin or not, returns a promise. So all settled is going to return when all those promises get done, when those 3 vendor bills got created, we get here with a bunch of outcomes. The difference between all and all settled is that all settled will never fail, will never reject. It will always resolve successfully. But the outcomes is going to be, we're going to know which ones failed and which ones got fulfilled successfully. So for the ones that got fulfilled successfully, I find out the quantity actually billed. I go find that item from that bill and I update its quantity actually billed with the outcome, with what came back from the server. Okay, great. And then I update them at the same time. I create some records in that new bills table, which is on the right there, that little thing over there, and I update and I show that. So that's why those 3 things showed up there. Okay, now I need to know what are the sales transactions that I'm going to update. So I loop through my items to bill, which is the same thing way up here. And then, okay, quantity left is okay, and I do some sort of logic, and I incrementally go through all the sales transactions that this item exists on, and I figure out how much am I actually going to bill, doing this sort of incremental stuff again, same logic as up here when I figured out the quantity to bill from the POs. Okay, so once that's done, this is again is for the UI to sort of signify how many transactions I'm going to have to update. I do a promise.all of all those items to update. And this isn't an all settled. And eventually we find the ones we're actually going to have to update that custom field on. And I turn this, I flatten this array into an array of calls to server plugin, update sales line. So the plugin has 2 functions, create vendor bill and update sales line that get called inside of all settles. So they could fail, but we can handle the failures and we can show errors if they do fail. So for each outcome that does fail, for every outcome that is rejected, we just display an error and hopefully things will be okay, but who knows. And then we update the sold items list. And in the end of the story, we hide all the notifications and that's the end.
I followed it, but don't ask me to explain it. I think it's pretty powerful. I could see different patterns. Couldn't I have done all of that on the server and, you know, figured that all out? And isn't this a little risky? What if the client browser
closes the window?
Closes the window? You know, there's like little things that I worry about.